Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking your, what day is today? Wednesday evening to share and learn about using data in the classroom. What I thought we would talk about today, and I should say, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to enter them in the chat or the Q&A box. I'm happy to take them as they come up or at the end, whatever's easier. What I thought we would talk about today are the benefits of using data. We'll start there. Some of the common concerns people have about using real data in the classroom, what we mean by quantitative reasoning skills and why those are so important. And then I thought I would give you some learning objectives and example assignments that you could drop into your own classes, as well as showing you some of the ICPSR resources that might help and other places that you can find data. And I should say that I think what you'll probably want is not me talking to you, but the slides, because they're full of links. So we will definitely make those available to you after the lecture. So the fact that you're here suggests that you see at least some good that could come from using real data in teaching, but people have actually studied this and found that there are real benefits to using real data in teaching. And by real data, I mean pretty much anything that's not synthetically generated or made up. So it can be anything from student data to the kind of secondary data that ICPSR provides. Using data in the classroom helps with students' quantitative literacies, which I'll describe a little bit in a minute. And that's how I've sort of focused this talk, but it also engages students with the content on a much more active level so that they actually remember the content better and understand it in a more in-depth way than they do when data aren't being used in the classroom. And there have been a number of studies on this. One of the more recent ones that I saw was they were evaluating a open source platform called TutorWeb. It's tutor-web, which is an online source for teaching statistics. And they did some studies having students do sort of paper and pencil, normal kind of statistics activities versus using the data in their platform, and found significantly better learning and recall with the actual data. It gives students practice thinking critically in a variety of contexts. One of the things that we know about quantitative skills are that we actually learn them at a really early age. So if you think about when you learned about percentages, you were probably in first or second grade. It just seems like somehow as we become adults, we start to see these things as hard or as maybe not the same from one context to another. So if we use data in teaching, it shows students that these are the same kinds of skills, whether it's biology, sociology, political science, psychology, whatever. It also teaches students the vocabulary of science, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It creates a bridge between substantive courses and the sort of more technical courses. And by this, I mean, probably thinking about your own experience. The fact that you're at the ICPSR summer program suggests that you have interest in research methods and statistics in a way that is probably above and beyond most of your peers. So you might have taken those research methods or statistics courses early in your undergraduate career, but having taught them and seeing what other people say, we know that most students put them off as long as they absolutely can, and they only take them when they're forced to do so. So often we get students in their junior or senior year, and they come into courses like research methods with the question, how is this gonna relate to my life? I'm not planning to go to graduate school. Why do I need to learn this stuff? But I would argue that if you use data in courses leading up to the research methods and statistics, it reinforces the idea that social sciences really are sciences. and it makes that link for students. So they can see, hey, this is how a sociologist works. This is why it's important for me to learn these things. And we know that even small exercises can make a big impact. So some of the examples I'll give you for ways to use data in the classroom are just simple 5-minute things that you can start class with and be on your way, and you will have made an impact in students' quantitative reasoning skills. No matter who they are, if you use data in class, all students will benefit. So um, the benefits of active learning are well understood in pedagogical research, and using data is a way of incorporating that kind of active learning across the curriculum. Um, a project at Carleton College in Minnesota has looked at quantitative skills and writing, and they actually find that it helps students with their clarity in writing, and they often use fewer fudge words. So instead of saying a lot of people think this, or the majority of people think that, they'll be able to be much more specific. And don't listen, because I'll probably use some of those fudge words in this presentation, even though I do this all the time. And what we really want is these kind of skills, these quantitative reasoning or empirical reasoning, to become a way of thinking. And that doesn't happen easily for a lot of students. So having chances to practice it sort of over and over and over again really helps it become sort of that habit of mind. It's also one of the skills that people are looking for in job candidates. So often we have to remind students to put something like data analysis or interpretation of data on their resumes, but it's a marketable skill. And then this is just a quote that supports that. I won't read it to you, but basically the idea is that data and interpreting data are crucial for where jobs are going in the next number of years. Using data, if you do it intentionally and thoughtfully, can really get students thinking a lot about what they experience in everyday life. So we typically, when we see something that's a number, we see a rate reported on the news, or a number of cases of people who have COVID, for example, we think it's an objective thing. It's solid. There's no subjective point to it. When in actuality, numbers and data are social constructions. So how we ask a question matters. Who we ask matters. When we ask matters. So getting students to think about all of those who, what, where, when questions early on. We tend to think of those as the sort of the realm of journalists, but actually it's the best way to think about approaching data as well. And for social sciences, it's really easy to include quantitative reasoning because it matches up with the substantive content so easily. There's so many things that you can demonstrate using real data that are topics you would be teaching anyway. And then there are a couple reasons that we may not always say out loud when we think about using data in the classroom, but they're worth thinking about. So if you're teaching an undergraduate class, like an introductory political science or introductory sociology, if you think about the number of students who pass through those classes, you actually will touch a lot more students than you would if you were just confining data to the research methods and statistics sequence. So it allows more students to practice those quantitative skills. It also draws talented students to the major. So as Mike said, I'm a sociology major, or sociology PhD. So I can pick on sociology a little bit, but we all kind of know that in a lot of schools, sociology is the major that the athletes take because it's easy, right? So it's just a bunch of talking about what your opinion is and things like that. That's what people think sociology is. If you introduce data right from the very beginning, you'll grab some of those students who might have otherwise gravitated toward more of a hard science or a computer science skills, because they see that their talents can be used within the social science majors themselves. And there have actually been studies that demonstrate that that actually does work. Using data and statistics in service courses, for example, often a sociology department will teach a statistics class that counts for any number of departments. Using data is a way that you can bring that disciplinary content into the statistics and data. So I taught, for example, at Eastern Michigan University, the statistics course in their sociology department. It was primarily not soc majors, but we started class every day with something from the popular press, some piece of data or statistics, and talked about it. And it was a way to introduce sociological concepts into the statistics class. I mentioned that it's marketable. It gives students marketable skills. We don't always admit that that's a goal, but it should be. And it's also really kind of fun. So it's easy to find both good examples and less than stellar examples of data use. For example, the pie chart that I have, or the pizza chart, I guess they call it, on this slide, if you look at it quickly, if you think about what you know about pie charts, they're supposed to add up to 100%. This one most certainly does not. It adds up closer to like 700%, I think. So it's easy to find examples for just about anything. When faculty think about using data in the classroom, a number of common concerns come up, and these have stayed consistent across time. The first, of course, is that it's time consuming. So it's both time consuming in preparing the exercise or the activity, finding the data, writing out the instructions, things like that. But it's also time consuming in terms of time that you're not using teaching the core subject in class. And so if you sort of think about data as conveying that core topic, it maybe makes the case for that time being well spent. There's obviously a concern about finding the right data. Folks at ICPSR did some interviews and focus groups with faculty who wanted to use data in undergraduate classes, but weren't quite sure how. And this was one of the things that came out loud and clear. Essentially, someone said, "We don't want to look like an idiot in front of the class," was basically their sentiment. So you want to make sure that the data have the point that you're trying to make. You don't want to do some analyses in class and find out, oh, wait, it's the opposite of what we just talked about or whatever. So finding the right data takes time and can be challenging, but I'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate data for use in class at the end. There's also the consideration of both student and instructor anxiety around quantitative information. So students who are quantitatively inclined may not gravitate towards social sciences. So the people that you have left in your social science classes may be a little bit anxious about quantitative information, especially when they come into a statistics class. They've sort of been trained to think that it's hard when really it isn't. And then there's the instructor anxiety. So we work with a lot of instructors who say, I'm not that strong in quantitative methods myself, so I don't want to use something in class that my students are going to ask me a question about and I'm not going to know the answer. So for some of the resources that ICPSR has created, we've taken steps to reduce that instructor anxiety as well. There's also the differing backgrounds of students. So some will come in knowing things like percentages and rates and percent change reading graphs and tables like the back of their hand. Other students will be encountering it again for the first time since high school or junior high. One of the things that is often a challenge within the social sciences is that we don't have the same kind of course sequence in general that disciplines like physics or biology or chemistry have, where people who are teaching the later courses know that students have learned specific skills in those early courses. If you think about most curricula for a social science major, it's often you need to take one or two classes at the introductory level, but they can be from a list of a wide range of potential options. You need to take some seminar sort of classes, but again, they're often topically based. And then you may have to take a research methods and a statistics, but it may not be specifically sequenced. So again, students may put it off until the end. That doesn't actually serve social scientists well. But if we can get in the habit of using data in all kinds of courses, then students will start coming at this with a more equal set of skills to begin with. And then there's also been some discussion more recently about the fact that data that we talk about as representative, so national samples, things like that, may not actually be representative, particularly for your students. And so there is some concern about how to deal with that. And that comes up mostly in issues of race and ethnicity, as well as sexuality. So you'll often hear the terms quantitative reasoning, quantitative literacy, numeracy, statistical literacy kind of thrown out. They have specific meanings, but in this context, the differences between them are much less than the similarities. So I'm going to use them interchangeably. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about quantitative reasoning or quantitative literacy. It's basically skills that are learned and used within a context. So if you think about a typical math course, you're often doing calculations on with numbers that have no context. So you get an equation and you figure out the answer, but it's not situated within any sort of bigger picture. But quantitative reasoning requires that bigger picture. And the kinds of skills that students should have from using data are things like reading and interpreting graphs or tables, being able to think about averages, so which average is the right one to use in a given circumstance, working within a scientific model, so knowing what variables are and what hypotheses are is another quantitative reasoning skill. Being able to understand and critically evaluate the numbers that they encounter every day is probably the leading goal of teaching quantitative literacy or quantitative reasoning skills. Things that we don't often think of as part of quantitative reasoning, but they actually are, include things like knowing what kinds of data would be useful in answering particular questions. So you don't even have to always work with the data to be fostering quantitative reasoning. Even sometimes just thinking about, okay, what kind of data would you need? Who would you have to talk to? What kind of measurements would you need to make to be able to address the question that you have? Those are all quantitative reasoning skills. Organizing data for analysis is another one that we think of it as sort of a humdrum task that we all have to kind of get through, but it actually is a skill. And I tried to put some interesting statistics and data screenshots throughout the presentation so that you at least have something to pay attention to rather than listen to me babble. But I love using these in class. They're from, and all of these are hyperlinked, so you'll be able to find them. These are from Rate My Professor. It's someone who takes the comments in Rate My Professor and quantifies them by the number of times specific words appear. So I just did a couple different words. So this is comparing males and females for whether students say they're interesting, easy, smart, things like that. And these are great to use with students because they are personally identifiable and relevant. And you can get into conversations about, well, is someone using the term smart in a positive way, or are they saying this person is not smart? And kind of what does that mean, and might that change what the distribution looks like? It's also interesting to see sort of where the different disciplines fall out. Students have a good time looking at those data. Put a different way, if you're thinking sort of about data literacy a little bit more broadly, particularly as data science becomes a discipline in its own right on more and more campuses. Sometimes data scientists think about quantitative reasoning or data literacy as making it possible for students to recognize the need for empirical data, be able to extract information from the data, so taking the underlying data and making sense of it, realizing that empirical data are social constructions, essentially, so they contain uncertainties and they may not exactly represent real world processes, and how to kind of think about how much of that uncertainty is there and how might it change the interpretations that you have. And then lastly, understanding that models are needed to make sense of data. That's a piece that data science adds to the quantitative reasoning skill set. So many people would argue that having students who are quantitatively literate as they go out and become fully participating adults in society is critical. There's so much information coming from so many different sources, needing to think about what makes sense and what doesn't from sort of a scientific perspective is a skill that's becoming more and more necessary for daily life. And we think we do it all the time without even thinking about it. So if you think about something like product reviews, so I just moved my office setup back to the office and had to buy a webcam. And so I was looking on Amazon and looking for the different levels of product reviews. And I automatically discounted the reviews that had like 2 or 3 people, even if they were 5 stars, because you know that it's really easy to have 5 stars if you have 3 people, and that sometimes the companies plant people to do reviews, things like that. Whereas if you have, 4.8 stars with thousands of people, that really says something different. So it's day-to-day applications that make quantitative reasoning skills important. Sorry. And if you think about the screenshot I have here is from the COVID tracking project. This last year has been just a great example of why quantitative reasoning skills are needed. People who know me well know that there were things that I could not let go, like the fact that news agencies often reported raw numbers of cases, which doesn't really mean anything unless you know what the underlying population size is. Or they would report the number of positive test results as the prevalence rate, when that too really depends on who was tested. So if you're not testing asymptomatic people, you're probably underrepresenting the prevalence rate. If you're only testing small groups of people who come to health facilities because they have these symptoms, you're probably overrepresenting the prevalence rate. So it all depends sort of, again, what's in that denominator. So as you think about incorporating data into your classroom, I always like to include some learning objectives on my syllabus to make it clear to students that this is an actual goal of mine. This isn't just, I'm not just making them use data because I'm a data person, but there really is some goal in mind to do it. So these are some example learning objectives that were taken from the, I think they're from the American College and Association of American Colleges and Universities Quantitative Reasoning matrix. But you might include things like students should be able to tell you why data are better than anecdotes. We all know the story of the N of one. Students should be able to explain why association does not necessarily mean causation. They should be able to consider definitional issues in the presentation of data. So who was asked exactly what question were they asked, things like that. They should be able to identify fallacies in empirical arguments and to recognize biases that may come out in both the data themselves as well as how those data are presented. I also often have what I think of as implicit learning objectives. So these are things that I may not put on my syllabus, but they're always sort of in the back of my mind. One of them is about scientific language. So we use a lot of words in social sciences that are used in everyday life, but they have slightly different meanings. And anyone who knows me knows that I probably care a little bit more than most people, and maybe more than I should, about the accuracy of word choice. But it really does matter. So teaching students that that data are the underlying numbers, or whatever, it could be text, whatever the source of information is, and that statistics are the resulting tables and charts. I work with a lot of data librarians who have numerous stories of students coming to them saying that they need data for a paper. The data librarian takes an hour trying to find the right data set, only to have students say, well, I really just need this table here that's on the census website later on. So the difference between data and statistics. Random is a word we typically use maybe to mean not so good. But if we think about random samples as being sort of the gold standard, that's a hard one for students to wrap their minds around. Also, one of my pet peeves is using the word experiment to describe any kind of study. If we model correct language use when we're using data in the classroom, it's a way for students to learn those distinctions. I also want to show students that data can come in many forms and from many sources. As I was putting this presentation together, I was reading some more recent articles, and one of them was talking about working students through housing data in London suburbs. And to do that, they used the archive on the campus and looked at essentially real estate listings from a century before, and then looked at current real estate listings and had students think about sort of how are the houses and the areas presented, and kind of dig through that information to come up with some sociological patterns. So they used the real estate advertisements as their data. And that the fit between the data and the research question is key. So people will often ask for good data. And you know what they really mean is data collected by credible sources and done in a way that's scientifically responsible. But I would argue that the correct data or the best data depend really on what your research question is, or the problem that you're trying to solve. There's not going to be one perfect data set for everything. And I want students to start to think about that, even in an introductory sociology class. Oops. Knowing the way that students can get tripped up by statistics also helps you think about examples to use. So again, definition issues, big numbers, anytime, and it's not just students, anytime we see big numbers in news stories, for example, they're often put there for impact. And we don't tend to think about, okay, but what's that in comparison to? So, so that's another thing that you'll want to emphasize maybe with students. Some of these are taken from Joel Best's book, Stat Spotting, and it's Stat Spotting, Field Guide to Dubious Data. And he talks about having some sort of benchmark numbers in your head so that you can see the big numbers that people present and think about, does that really make sense? Or is that really as big of an issue as they're saying it is? People trying to make different points using different measures of central tendency, but always calling it the average. Students get tripped up by that. Percent versus percent change. Things that that seem simple on the face, but when you're actually applying them to what you're seeing in day-to-day reports, they may be a little bit confusing for somebody who hasn't thought as much about them. There are all kinds of funky graphics that trip people up. That pizza chart that they got away with by saying it's not a pie chart, it's a pizza chart, is just one example. We know that we need to teach students to look at things like, are the axes labeled, and does the x-axis actually start at 0, for example, because you can change the story that data tell just by changing the way they're displayed. And I love this quote. It's from the COVID website that I showed earlier. If you see dramatic movement in the data, look for contextual clues before interpreting it as actual change in the pandemic. So they're talking about the examples or the instances of things like data dumps, where an organization may not have reported data for a certain period of time, and then all of a sudden they report all their data for that period of time. So you see a really large increase in the number of cases or the number of deaths or whatever it is, but that increase is false because it's just that the data weren't there and now they are. That was another annoying thing about reporting on COVID. A lot of news reporters seemed surprised that the cumulative rates of case counts and deaths were always going up. But if you think of the meaning of cumulative counts, there's no way they can do anything but go up. So again, sort of trying to make the message into something that it really isn't. When we think about, people have determined that there are a number of best practices for doing so. And the first is really scaffolding learning. So I've talked about thinking about using data in introductory classes all the way up through that senior seminar kind of class. So the more times you use it, the better students get it. We also know that because of that, the fear of student anxiety and not wanting to be poorly evaluated on student evaluations at the end of the semester, we tend to give more explicit instructions with quantitative information than we do for other kinds of assignments. And so there's been at least one case where they found that students really weren't learning the skills, they were learning to read the instructions. So we need to be, there's a delicate balance between scaffolding and then making sure that we pull some of that that foundation out from under students so that they are thinking about it on their own. Emphasizing the process or understanding rather than numbers. So not asking on an exam how many people said this, but rather asking for trends or something like that, so that students are thinking more in a process mindset. Incorporating a sense of discovery. So allowing students to choose the variables that they're interested in, or you sort of set out the beginning of the assignment and then having students move from there so that they're making connections on their own. That sense of discovery is important for data use. Group or collaborative work is really good for teaching quantitative skills. A number of people have talked about this in terms of teaching statistics. Even something as easy as a think, pair, share exercise where you ask students a question, have them think about it for a couple minutes and write down their answer, then turn to their neighbor and talk to their neighbor about what they wrote, and then sharing out as a full class what some of the ideas came up with. And the reason that group work is particularly important in quantitative skills is that it allows students not only to hear different voices say things in slightly different ways, but if you think about, I know this is true for me, a lot of the complex concepts I didn't really understand until I had to teach them to someone else. So that that activity of trying to explain it to someone else actually solidifies your own understanding. And so that works if you can use that to the student's advantage. And then I talked about having some personal interest and using real world data. Those are all considered best practices if you're going to be using data in the classroom. Just a few easy ideas, and hopefully this will show you that incorporating data doesn't have to be a huge semester-long project. I mentioned that when I was teaching a statistics class, I started class every day with something that had been in the media, some sort of representation of data or statistics. That was an easy 5-minute thing to do that actually had the benefit of sort of focusing students and starting to get them to get their mind off of the exam that they took in the last class, or the fight that they just had with their roommate, or the date that they have after your class, and get them thinking about the subject matter. So it's 5 minutes well spent. And it's just a good way of giving lots of opportunities for practicing quantitative skills, and having students bring in stories that that you can use to start class is another great way to give extra credit, or something like that. Tying survey data to the topic of the lecture is another easy way to incorporate data. And so someone who teaches public policy at U of M has told me that she teaches specifically about energy and the environment kind of things. And students at U of M tend to be a little bit more liberal in their ideas about climate change and global warming, and kind of what are the causes and the consequences thereof, than the national population might be. And so she often has students compare themselves to some of the nationally representative samples on asking the same questions about the energy and the environment, to show them that if they're working in a policy area, they're going to come up against people who don't believe that global warming is a real thing. So that's an easy way to tie survey data to the topic of the lecture. Using real data as examples for problems or on exams. This is easy in theory. Sometimes it's a little bit harder because creating the data set to make the example may take a little bit more work than you initially think. But even pulling something like a data representation in the media and using it as an extra credit question on an exam allows students to practice those skills that you've given them and to learn something in the process. Replicating published results is another way to incorporate data, as well as looking at documentation from secondary data sets if you're teaching research methods, for example, to come up with real life examples of the concepts that you're talking about. Using data from students, I linked here to an article, and they talk about a little bit about the kind of thing with tying survey data to lecture, but they start with doing a survey of students on their own college campus, so that they kind of use that throughout the semester and do some comparisons between those students and the larger In this case, they're based in the UK, so the larger British survey data. And one of them that I thought was interesting, and I think I will definitely do it the next time I teach, somebody was teaching an introductory level sociology class, but decided to use student quiz scores and exam scores to demonstrate regression modeling. So they predicted the first exam based on the quiz scores, and then the second exam based on the first exam and the quiz scores. And it got students to think about what variables aren't accounted for when you're only using scores from previous exams. And they actually had students work through and predict their own second exam score, for example, using the equation from the data that they had for the quizzes and first exams. I mentioned that for social sciences, it's pretty easy to tie data to content. So there are all kinds of sources for data about pay differences in tax bases and funding for schools, differences in job types or by race and gender, related to any number of kinds of topics that you might be talking about in class. Exploring attitudes about policy relevant topics is another way to bring in data. Understanding trends over time, or putting some work in a current or historical context. I read something by a French professor who has her students watch movies in French and then rate them against census data and other publicly available data to say how realistic are they at portraying whatever the time period is that they're supposed to be portraying. So now that I've convinced you, hopefully, that using data is a good thing, I thought I would show you just a couple different ways that we can make it easier, we as in ICPSR and other sources. So ICPSR has a number of different ready-made exercises, data-driven learning guides. I'm not going to go through all these. I've given you links, but they were developed with the sole purpose of incorporating data into introductory level sociology classes. We often talk about them as sort of the gateway drug to data. So you're getting students to use data without realizing that what they're doing is supposed to be hard. We also have learning modules that are a little bit longer, and I wanted to note that we will have a new version of the setups voting behavior module based on the American National Election Study. That will be out this fall. We've got a couple of instructors working on that as we speak. We also have a number of sources if you want to replicate published results. So the screenshot I have here is a teaching module that works through Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. And we just heard that Putnam is going to deposit his data with ICPSR. So, so we will have an even broader base of data for which to do the replication. This is already a number of years old. But we also house archives for a number of journals and replication data and code in what we call Open ICPSR, our self-publishing archive. So those are all great places to look for sources if you're thinking about replicating results. ICPSR has lots of data. I think we're currently at 16,000 something studies, which can include one or more data sets. We typically group them in a number of different thematic collections that I've shown here. Again, all are linked to those archive homepages. And then we also have what we call the member archive, where data that are for which curation is paid for by the ICPSR membership are held. So that's another source of data that you have access to. Open ICPSR, the self-publishing branch of ICPSR also is broken down into some topical archives, as well as having just sort of a general, people can deposit generally to open ICPSR, but this is where you'll find things like the COVID-19 repository, and FACTS is the firearms among children and teens. So again, just other sources if you're looking for data on particular topics. I would argue that you can actually use data without using statistical software or using data themselves. So we have an online analysis tool so that you don't have to teach your students SPSS, SAS, Data R, any of those. They don't have to be on computers that have licenses for any of that software. They can do it right from the website. And we've got about just under 1,500 studies, I think, that have the online analysis capabilities. We have a search and compare variables tool, which I have a screenshot of in the next slide, but this is great for teaching about operationalization or sampling, as well as teaching substantive examples. Well, I'll show you what it looks like in a second. It's also a good way for students, if they're putting together a survey of their own, they can use questions that other people have used without having to reinvent the wheel and come up with them themselves. And you can use it essentially as a question bank to have students do that comparison between class characteristics and the respondents of a national survey. And then we also have lots of data documentation and research reports that can be used. This is a social science variables database. You can see that it shows you a frequency distribution of each of the variables. I figured by now in the presentation you might be getting a little bit bored, so I looked for bored in the variables database and came up with a number of different questions. And here, some of the questions were asked of older adults, and some were asked of children. And so you can see that older adults tend to be pretty evenly split on whether they've been bored in the past few weeks, whereas students tend not to think that school is quite as boring, or not quite as many students think that school is boring. Again, good for talking about operationalization or the effects of different samples on results. I use it when I teach sociology of the family. We look at marital status and when did cohabitation become a valid option. And we talk about where did people put themselves before that? Is it the case that people really started cohabiting in the 1970s and 80s? No, we know that it happened before, but they're not represented in that survey data. I've also given you a number of places to look for government data. So all of these agencies are considered sort of part of the federal statistical system. So they all collect and produce data and reports, and many of them have interactive components to their website. So you can send students to the website and have them do some mapping, or have them create tables based on the data. So they often have both summary statistics and raw data. They may have administrative records, for example, about schools and school districts, and they also often have research reports based on those data. I had reports on the slide before about what ICPSR can provide, because it's worth thinking about introducing students to data by looking at a research report. Often they're just descriptive statistics. So students realize, hey, I do have some skills. I could write something like this. I completely understand something like this. It's often an easier way to introduce students to social science than maybe a journal article might be. Data.gov is the source for open government data, or publicly available government data. So they have something like 300,000 different data sets on a number of different topics, and in quite a variety of different formats. So there's mapping data, there's images, and they also represent all levels of government. So anything from city or township up through national data. I am aware of time and wanting to make sure I leave time for questions. I've also given you a couple slides that have other places that are good starting points when you're looking for data. So Fred is out of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So it's really good if you're looking for any kind of economic data. They have interactive tools. The Association of Religion Data Archives have amazing teaching resources and mapping tools and a question bank. Social Science Data Analysis Network, or SSDAN, relies almost exclusively on census data. IPUMS is also primarily census data, the American Community Survey and others. Think about blogs that include this kind of information. So Graphic Detail is a blog that includes the quantitative information. The Pew Research Center is another organization that both collects data and produces reports and interactive tools for interpreting the data. Worldometer, if you're just looking for quick facts. The Roper Center is great for political polling data. And they also have a fantastic question bank. And then even Google is a good source for public data. There's also Google Datasets search, where you can find data on any number of topics. ICPSR's catalog is included in the Google Dataset search. But the kinds of data that are in public data are often from government agencies, but not only in the US. When you come across data and you're thinking about using it for teaching, the kinds of things that you think about might be a little bit different than if you were evaluating it for use in your research project. So you might start with thinking about, do you want an online analysis tool or some kind of interactive interface? So mapping or creating cross-tabulation tables or something like that. That's great, particularly in distance learning, so students can do it on their own. They don't need to have access to a specific statistical package, and you don't have to teach them that statistical package. So it allows you to focus on the substantive content. Is there specific topical content that you're looking for to highlight in your class? So thinking about the right places to look for that. And then thinking about sort of the nuts and bolts of the data. So are there enough variables and cases for students to do what you want them to do with the data? This is particularly important if you're teaching a statistics kind of class. And then one thing we often don't think about, but should, is how easy are the data for you to learn and use? So do you have to do a lot of work behind the scenes to get them ready for students? And by that, I mean thinking about, are missing values declared? Is there question text present so that if you create a chart, students have the context they need to be able to interpret the information in that table or chart? Do you need to recode a lot of variables or create or recode dummy variables, things like that? So again, I'm not going to read this slide to you. Using data in teaching is good. That's the short message that I'm going to leave you with. And that it doesn't have to be a full semester-long project for it to have benefits. It can be just 5 minutes at the beginning of class or a question on an exam. And I mentioned that these are some of the sought-after job skills, just showing you that my statement is based on data and not just an anecdote. And if you use data from ICPSR, we always encourage you, this is for any of you that may still be graduate students as well as faculty who are teaching students. If you use data that are either held by or pointed to from ICPSR, enter them in the student paper competition. We have first place is $1,000, second place is $750, and you get your paper published on the website. And potentially do a webinar and things like that. So it's a great thing to put on a CV. And with that, I think I've left hopefully enough time for questions, but I have not been paying any attention to the chat or the question boxes.
You did fine, Lynette, and thank you for a very interesting and jam-packed presentation, which includes not only all of the links in your slides, but making the slides available afterwards. We're going to take questions in the chat and moderate the questions for Lynette. I wanted, while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I wanted to mention one thing. You began by talking about quantitative reasoning skills or literacy in the context of sort of a typology of courses. And there's one other kind of course that I would mention for those in the audience, which would be one that involves a kind of a capstone project. Mm-hmm. So in addition to a substantive course with a little data, or a statistics or methods course, focusing on data, sometimes an instructor will be teaching a course in which there's a final paper due. And I use that as a capstone project, broadly construed. So these skills built into the course can contribute qualitatively to that final project. And many majors, our concentrations have a thesis project that comes at the end of the major senior year project. And these skills can contribute obviously to the quality of a senior thesis project, as well. So
absolutely.
Let me look in the chat. Well, right now I have a thank you as a comment, but not a question.
I think I probably put everyone else to sleep.
No. I'll make another comment to get your reaction based upon listening to the presentation. And speaking as someone who had taught a quantitative reasoning course in the past. My own experience as an instructor was that teaching the process of operationalization was very important because of the differences in operationalization. The translation of a concept to a variable or a set of variables is very important because of obviously the range of ways in which that can be done. And one of the ways that I found was useful for students was to engage them in a conversation about college quality and how you could measure the quality of colleges, especially from the perspective of high school students and their families. And we could have a conversation about what the determinants of quality might be. And then I gave them some data from US News and World Report and Money Magazine and asked them to look at the relationship between these two measures. And it turns out, of course, that they're negatively correlated because money focuses on cost and quality measured as bang for the buck. And US News and World Report focuses on selectivity, which is often associated with the most expensive private colleges.
That makes sense.
It was an interesting exercise for them. They could also use some of the component data to construct their own index. But it was a kind of a glaring example of how alternative operationalizations can produce quite different results.
I have used a similar, I've used college placement rates post-graduation, because some colleges ask just, do students have a job after graduation, without thinking about, is it full-time, part-time, is it related to their major? So these schools that have, 98% placement rates, what does that really mean? And same thing, it was relevant to students. So it felt like they really learned a lot about operationalization using that kind of relevant example.
So I have a question for you, Lynette. It says, you touched on this a bit, but what is the best method to approach students that don't have a strong background in statistics? I find that these students often have the most to contribute to the field once they're able to utilize the necessary quantitative skills.
Absolutely. And the best person to talk about this is one of ICPSR's council members, Esther Wilder. She also has been affiliated with the summer program, but she talks a lot about students initially in her classes that don't have the kinds of quantitative skills, and in part aren't interested because they feel like they're not represented in the data, and that when they learn some of those skills, they actually start to see the power of data and quantitative reasoning. But in terms of approaching students without or with less statistical background, I think a couple things come to mind. One is, again, sort of that scaffolding. So if you give them multiple opportunities and come at things from different perspectives. So it might be talking about something that they see in the media one day. It might be doing something like a data-based exercise, like a data-driven learning guide another day, where like the data-driven learning guides actually give students hints about how to think about the statistics. So they don't assume that students have any statistical background, and it sort of provides some of that scaffolding. I had two things and I just, the other thing that I think really works well is doing a lot of the small group or pair work. Again, it helps both the student who has less of a quantitative background because they're hearing the explanation in different words than the instructor may use, and often from someone who is closer in terms of experience and learning. We know that as we become experts in fields, we actually think differently about how to solve problems and content in those fields. And so having students work with each other, make sure that they're talking to someone who is thinking in a lot of the same ways that they are. So I don't know, those would be probably my two biggest suggestions.
We have a question from Jasmine Noel Yarish. Could you please give some more insight into the difference between the terms quantitative reasoning and data literacy?
Sure, I think. So I used to know the differences between all of them. So quantitative reasoning, quantitative literacy, statistical literacy, data literacy, numeracy. But basically between quantitative reasoning and data literacy, to me, one has a greater focus on, I don't know, there's a lot of overlap between them, but data literacy often comes at questions about sort of how are the data generated, where do they come from, and different sources of data that may not be things that we typically think of. So Fitbit tracker data or transaction data. So dealing with the kinds of big data issues that are becoming much more common. Data science tends to use data literacy as their sort of umbrella term. whereas quantitative reasoning is a lot of that, but also the interpretation skills. Data literacy doesn't have quite as strong of a focus on the interpretation skills, I think would be how I would describe the difference between those.
I think sometimes people use quantitative reasoning to refer to an understanding of the scientific method and its implications, hypothesis testing, replication, and so on, while data literacy often has to do with, with, as you mentioned, data sources or measurement issues, and things like that. There's another question. Oh, Daniel Velez Ortiz asked a question. Do you have a recommendation for finding data that is representative for underrepresented populations or to demonstrate data equity?
That is a fantastic question. And the first place that I would direct you to is ICPSR's Resource Center for Minority Data, RCMD. They were started in about 2000, the early 2000s. And their initial focus was on racial and ethnic minority populations in the United States. They've since broadened to immigrant populations and racial and ethnic minorities in other societies. And their most recent focus has actually been on sexual minorities. So people who don't fit into the typical gender categories or the typical sexual orientation categories. So they have a lot of data that either have oversamples of those populations or are specifically targeted at those populations. That would be the first place I would tell you to look.
I think that one way to think about data inequity, if it fits in with, other elements of a course, is to engage students in a discussion of findings from epidemiological cohort studies. Because up until recently, most of what we learned from these cohort studies, for example, a big study of heart functioning, was based upon Harvard alumni, all male, based upon studies of members of the military, who of course are a captive audience, also at the time primarily male, so that a lot of what we understood about health for quite a period of time was really an understanding of men's health, but didn't really contain very much information about women's health. But the same thing could be said about studies of whites that in relation to non-whites, for example. But various government agencies, for example, including, as you know, the National Science Foundation, have supported for some time recently equivalent studies that had so-called nationally representative samples, which were primarily white, but replicated for Asians, Asian Americans, or for African Americans. We had a project which was discussed in a Blaylock lecture last summer about the national study of Black Americans, or the Black election study. So with some skillful research on the web of ICPSR resources, as well as other resources, it's possible to, I mean, this is the question of representativeness with sufficient sample sizes, right? So it's possible to identify data sets that would be useful either for comparative research or for a focus on a particular subpopulation.
Absolutely. And I think the epidemiological example is a fantastic one. Even on the COVID website that I have early in the presentation, they have a section on what we know and what we don't know about race and gender differences in COVID prevalence and effects.
Other questions from the audience? Okay. Thank you, Lynette, very much for this very interesting presentation. We have recorded the presentation. It'll be available on the summer program's YouTube channel. I want to remind you that we have another lecture tomorrow night, and the topic will be what we can learn about parenting from social media data. Be another interesting topic. Thanks again for attending, and thanks again, Lynette.
Thank you.